Good afternoon and welcome to this lunch briefing organized by the Graduate Institute on the Israeli election. I'm Christine Lutranger and I have the pleasure to moderate this event today. So our guests are Riccardo Bocco and Saïd. So let me just introduce them briefly. Riccardo is Professor of Anthropology and Sociology at the Graduate Institute. He's also faculty associate at the Albert Hirschman Center on Democracy and at the Center on Conflict, Development and Peacebuilding. His areas of expertise include armed conflicts and military occupation, humanitarian action and intervention, diasporas and refugees. His main geographical area of fieldwork for the last 35 years has been the Near East, with a focus on Jordan, Israel, Palestine and Lebanon. His current research project is titled Violence, Memory and Cinema, and it explores the role of documentary film and fiction films in reconstructing collective identities during armed conflicts, in post-civil wars and in post-dictatorship contexts. I also like to mention his recently authored article for our center's commentary series, and which is on the topics that we will discuss today, and which was entitled The Pandemic, the American Peace Plan, and What is Left of Palestine, which was published in May 2020. And our other guest is Saïd, who is professor at the Department of International History and Politics. His areas of expertise include global history, decolonization, Cold War, historiography. He recently published a book entitled The Middle East and the Making of the Modern World, published in 2017. And I'd also like to mention the book manuscript that he's working on, and which is entitled Global Middle Eastern and North African Histories, a 20th Century Primary Source Reader, which is a series of annotated texts that document the varied roles that Middle Eastern have played in modern global histories. So I'm really delighted to have you both with us today to comment on the results of the elections in Israel. So we have, as you and the audience might already know the format, 1 hour, which will be first devoted to a series of preliminary comments from both of you. We will start with Cyrus, who will share also some data about some results on the elections, and then we'll give the word to Riccardo. So the participants have the possibility to raise questions with the Q&A chat box, which is located on the right part of the screen. So feel free to use it even during the presentation. So I will take the questions in the second part of this meeting. So the good part of these online meetings is that we may have participants joining from beyond the Grad Institute in Geneva. So it would be also interesting to know the names and possibly the affiliations, if you'd like, when you ask your questions or share your comments. And the last information I would like to give is that this event is recorded, so that you know it, and it will be available on the Graduate Institute's YouTube channel. So I think that's it for the short introduction, and I would leave Cyrus the word to start. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christine, for introducing. And thank you also for the Institute technical support that has made all of this possible. I am loading now a PowerPoint. Let me see whether it is up. I think, is it good, Christine? Can you see it on your end? Thank you so much. Okay, so I will talk for about 15 minutes at most, and then hand over to Riccardo. Here's a quick overview. You can already see the overall theme, deadlock. I'll talk quickly about the past, then I get to the present outcomes of the elections, and in the end talk about future coalition building options and other lessons. So deadlock, and deadlock is the theme. Okay, so two quick things about the recent past reason, right? And the cause for this election. Why a fourth election in basically 2 years? The basic cause is, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's legal woes. As you well may know, he is presently in court. There are three main sort of files pending against him. And if he ceases being prime minister, he can go to prison. If he is prime minister or becomes president, he doesn't. So he has a lot of at stake here. I should perhaps add that this past deadlock has taken, certainly in the past 2 years, but to a degree perhaps a little bit before, but certainly in the past 2 years, really the form of a dysfunctional government. One key aspect is the fact that Israel hasn't had a proper budget in 2 years now, which means that you can't do long-term planning and that you can't do a whole lot of infrastructural and other things that you as a government looking forward would want to do. Now let me come to the present, right? Deadlock, exclamation mark. I have 4 slides here. So as you can see, this is as of today in the morning, the projected seat division. Things may still change a little bit. It's not entirely clear. At the moment, there are 13 parties, right? You have one really big party, the Likud, gets basically 25% of the entire vote. Then you have one somehow smaller party, well, basically more or less half of the Likud. And then, and this is the important point, you have 11 parties that are under 10 seats, right? Between 4 and 9 seats. And it is this extreme stretch that is of interest here. It presents and it represents, I think, a multiple split country, right? Along 5 main lines, perhaps one could even add others: class, politics, religiosity, nationality, as well as Jewish ethnicity, as you can see here, right? I don't really have time to go into all of them or even any of them. What you need to know is that the country sociologically, if we may put it this way, split in multiple ways, and these multiple ways basically created this map. We can talk in Q&A if you want about the past, how things used to be a little bit different, if not actually quite differently. And we can talk also in Q&A about the present, parallels to some other countries. So I wouldn't say that Israel is a total exception, but it's certainly some sort of an outlier of a bit. I should add 2 things about this multiple splits, right? There are a couple of factors here, 2 key ones that actually worsen this situation. One is the fact that some splits are aligned and hence reinforce each other. A key example is that of class and politics. So richer people in Israel tend to vote for center and leftist parties. Poorer people tend to vote for rightist parties. There are exceptions. There is a clear trend here. These 2 trends reinforce each other. A second trend, or that's actually even the trend, that's a reality, is that there are splits within each split. To give you a good example, you look here at religiosity, right, at religion. There's not only one religious party, there are 2 religious parties. Basically one for each main Jewish ethnicity, an Ashkenazi one and a Sephardi one. They are, however, also attenuating factors, right? The splits are not absolute. I mean, there never are, right? But I mean, there are really important ways in which they are not absolute. So I wouldn't say that, Arabs and Jews simply do not get along full stop. Reality is much more complicated, right? There's to a degree, there is some sort of hierarchically organized coexistence. There are also attempts to integrate parties into it, not integrate parties, but there are attempts by some Jewish parties to appeal to Arab parties, and to a little degree the other way around, just to give you one example, right? There are other examples as well. The secular religious division is not hard at all, right? It's a more of a continuum of sorts when you actually think about it. Then there are other sort of attenuating factors, and that concerns bridge builders. There are a good number of them. The most important one that you may be surprised, but when you think about it, you may not be, is the Prime Minister himself, right? So he presides over a coalition that includes the 2 key traditionally non-Zionist religious parties, right? Those 2 religious parties that, however, at this point have basically become more or less Zionist. Certainly Shas, the Sephardi one, has. but he himself is a very secular person, right? So, and the Likud itself, the party over which he presides, is a pretty ultimately still more or less secular party with an important religious component, but traditionally was more or less secular, and it still is, I would say, in its majority, that the members of parliament are in their majority secular, right? And Netanyahu is a sort of a bridge builder between these different constituencies to a degree, but an important degree. Last point, take a look at this chart, right? So this is the seat division in the Knesset right now, right? Right now, as of this morning. So there is a blue part that's firmly pro-Netanyahu. That includes the Likud and a couple of other parties. There is a red part that you see that is firmly anti-Netanyahu. And then there are two parties, green, right, which haven't really committed, right? Certainly basically in either side. You need, for a majority, you need 61 seats. So neither the anti-Netanyahu nor the pro-Netanyahu coalition, as it were, if there is a coalition at all, actually has, at this moment, has a majority, right? And this brings me to the future, to the question whether coalition building could actually break, at least temporarily, this deadlock. And there are a couple of options here, but each has its own problem. The first one is the problem with a possible Netanyahu coalition, right? That could include not only the Likud and the religious parties, but also the far right, really extreme right, Jewish religious Zionism party, which you see represented on the right here, as well as a small Arab party, which at this moment has 4 seats. Okay, things may still change, but at this moment it has 4 seats. And the head of this Arab party, Mansour Abbas, is probably the most pragmatic, perhaps you could say practical, of the main Arab Palestinian leaders in Israeli politics right now. And he basically saying, I'm not, as long as somebody isn't saying no to me, I'm not going to say no to him, even to Netanyahu. And he's saying this openly. The underlying reason being things that I don't want to get into because Riccardo will unpack them, okay? Now you can imagine that, you know, extreme right-wing Zionists don't want to sit with somebody like Mansour Abbas and his party in the same coalition. And that's actually exactly what they said this morning, right? They said, absolutely over our dead bodies is this going to happen. But whether this is really true or not, who knows? We will see. This may also simply be tactical grandstanding in the very end. Weirder things have happened, I would say. Second possible coalition building is the anti-Netanyahu bloc. And as you can see, things are really complicated here, okay? So in the center, you have Yair Lapid, who is the head of Yesh Atid, which is the second biggest party with 17 seats. On the right, you have 3 leaders of really right-wing parties, who, however, for different reasons, either do not at all want to be in a coalition with Netanyahu. That's the gentleman at the top and at the bottom, Gideon Saar on the bottom and Avigdor Lieberman on the top. And then there is the guy in the middle, and that is Naftali Bennett, who has publicly said 2 or 3 days before the election that he's not going to sit in a government that's headed by Yair Lapid in the middle. Though, you know, promises have been made before and have been broken before. So one will see. So there is this one problem here that Bennett has with Lapid. And then there's the problem that all 3 of them have, at least in theory at this point, with the Arab parties, including Mansour Abbas, but also the 6-seat, basically a joint coalition that is represented by the main sort of politician here, Ayman Aoudeh. But also here, you know, maybe there will be a certain amount of pragmatism involved, but it's going to be a real ideological stretch. So just to give you one example, the guy on the top, Avigdor Lieberman, has certainly in the past been, extremely anti-Arab, right? And whether somebody like Aoudeh wants to sit in the same coalition with him, maybe, perhaps not. Again, weirder things have happened, but it's going to be a real stretch. So what are some other options here, right? One would be the coalition government, negotiations fail, and there is a fifth election in less than 3 years. Second option, there is a minority government, right? A government that has not 61, but less than 61 seats, but gets supported in one way or another, the very first round, by some other parties, right? It's from the outside, as it were. Then, thirdly, there is always the possibility of defectors, right? And Netanyahu is like by far the most, seasoned politician in Israeli politics, and it's not impossible that he's going to be able to basically tempt by promising jobs, by promising, ministerial positions, one or two people who now are sitting in a party that basically does not want to sit with him, to ditch that party and join the coalition, getting him to 61. Looking sort of further afield, the 2-year-long deadlock that has basically now been repeated, right, has led a good number of observers in the Israeli political system to, call for a change of one or several of the three sort of parameters of the Israeli electoral system that you see here, right? So right now, all of Israel is one single electoral region, which is, for instance, different than, let's say, in Switzerland, right, where you have cantons and things of this sort, or in the United States, right, where you have states. In Israel, the whole country is simply one electoral region. So some people say maybe we should divide it. Maybe that will help to force parties to basically combine, become bigger, and then the deadlock will be broken. The hurdle now that you need to cross as a party to get into the parliament is 3.25%. Some people say let's raise the hurdle. And then last but not least, right now the leader of the biggest party basically de facto is asked by the president to try forming a coalition government. And some people say, well, maybe that should change too. Maybe the head of the biggest party automatically, by law, becomes the new prime minister, and whatever happens afterwards, even if it's a minority government, too bad. We just need to get out of this deadlock. So these are my couple of slides. This is really a sort of a first shot. I'm very happy to talk more about the basically, personal political reasons for this election, right? Rather than basically a policy caused, election in the Q&A. And I hand over to Riccardo. And I will stop sharing my slides. Here we go.
Thank you, Cyrus. Your presentation is, as usual, precise, rich, and very articulated. I'd like to begin with a number of remarks following your presentation. The first one, I think that if David Ben-Gurion was alive and looking at the results of this election, he would be very upset. In fact, there is a discrepancy between the electoral law that has been voted 48-49, which is still the electoral law with the proportionality system, doesn't match with I would say, the evolution of the Israeli society. These elections seems to show quite well how Israeli society is fragmented, is divided. I mean, 13 parties is quite a lot. And you very well summarized the issues at stakes in terms of politics, economy, class, religion, whatever. It is, from my point of view, as if part of the Israeli society today is asking for Israel to be more Jewish. And another part of Israeli society is asking for being more democratic. And they are torn apart, the 13 parties, around these two main questions, I would say. There is also another point that, at least as a European observer, worries me. The fact that from 77 onwards, from when the Likud took over from the Labour Party, politics in Israel have been going more and more towards right and extreme right. Why so? We are even confronted now, beside the Zionist religious party, somebody like Bezalel, Smotrich, etc., which you mentioned before in passing. But who would have imagined that somebody like Itamar Ben-Gvir, which is ideologically linked to the Mer Kahane group, which was the first party declared as a terrorist group in Israel, after 26 years, they are coming back to parliament. So that's I think, a really worrying issue in looking at the evolution of the political stance in Israel. Now, also, before talking about the Arab voters, we are, I mean, tomorrow, by this time, we should know the final results. Still, we are missing the counting of the votes from the military and for the expats, plus the people who have the COVID. You told me before, Cyrus, they are no more than 1,500, the ill people. But still, one can guess if the results from the votes from the military and the expats would change. Probably not, probably not. But having said that, and going back to your speculations about the building alliances, there is definitely an issue for Netanyahu, because not only if he is not prime minister with the trial spending on his head, he will be in dire straits. But more than that, if he has a majority, he can try, or he can hope that the majority of the Knesset will vote the immunity for the prime minister. And this, I think, is the goal that he's trying to reach for himself. Now, well, if we go back to the question of the Arab voters, who constitute around 20% of the overall Israeli population today, well, there I think Netanyahu has been very good in blowing up the joint list. Probably those who have been following the campaign have been seeing that Netanyahu has been campaigning among the Arab voters with posters where he was naming himself Abu Yair. So taking an Arab jargon, I mean, he is the father of Yair Netanyahu, his son, but making himself some way more familiar with a local constituency. And basically, he has promised, first of all, that if he is elected, he would open direct flights from Tel Aviv to Mecca for the Muslim pilgrimage. But more than that, and this is an outcome of the normalization treaties with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain in particular, the one for Morocco and Sudan are less relevant for the Arab voters. This means that for the first time, a number of Arab citizens of Israel are able to travel to the Gulf countries. Not only they can travel, but they can also find job opportunities. So the dynamic would be very interesting, because by migrating to the Gulf, the number of Arab residents in Israel would be lowering down, with all the advantages that these migrant Arab citizens of Israel migrating would send back remittances. So this would be a very tricky, interesting thing for Netanyahu as an argument, you see. Okay, I think I will leave for the Q&A session other points that I can make, but definitely this time with the Arab voters, their rate to the polls has been 50%, 5% lower than the previous elections, if I'm not wrong. On the one side. On the other side, the split of the joint list makes that today we have 6 seats for the joint list and 4 as of today for Ram, the Islamist party led by Mansour Abbas, who clearly shows the internal division among the Arab voters. So I would conclude in saying that the scenarios that Cyrus has presented before, with the possibilities of maybe an Arab party, Ram, entering for the first time in the history of Israel, entering the government, this would be the genius maybe of Netanyahu to save his own skin. That's, I conclude on that, and I leave the floor to our moderator.
Thank you very much, Riccardo and Cyrus, for this excellent and very useful comments and also information, because this is something which is still in the making in terms of the results. So for the discussions, I see, of course, many themes and many sub-themes that we could develop. I would propose to take 3 of them. So also seeing the Q&As, or at least the questions so far in the chat box. So thank you for those questions. Thank you for attending these events. I see more than 90 participants connected. So I think the 3 first themes I propose to address would be first, in fact, the elections themselves, analyzing the results, further analyzing the results and its consequences. The second theme would be on more broader processes at play in Israeli society, and the third theme would be on the international dimensions of the election and of the further developments in the Israeli government. So for the first aspect, we have a question on the role that the successful vaccination campaign undertaken by Netanyahu has played. So let me just get back to the question for to be more precise. Yes. So Helena Han is asking you if you could reflect a bit on the importance of the largely successful vaccination campaign in getting the Likud more votes. In other words, how decisive of an issue was it now, and how long can Netanyahu ride on this wave? Saïd, would you like to take this first?
Yes. Well, to basically reflect what most Israeli commentators have said, and I tend to agree with them, I don't think, crazily enough, that COVID actually played a role. Netanyahu and the Likud did not get more votes, but they also did not really get less votes, right? He certainly tried to use the fact that the vaccine rollout was a success and is a success. On the other side, in 2020 was very messy, right? In all sorts of different ways. The perhaps societally most problematic one was the fact that a good number, but not all Orthodox, didn't really play by the rules, which really, excuse my French, pissed off a good number of people on the other side, okay? On the more secular side of Israeli society. That's just one issue. There were other issues as well. So I don't quite know why this didn't have an effect. One possible explanation is that the two things even basically canceled each other out: the mismanagement of 2020 and the success of 2021. Another possible reason or reading would be to say that it just simply didn't matter because ultimately other things are simply more important to the voters. And I would tend to think that it's probably more of the latter. And maybe I can add one little thing here, but the really important thing here. This election, the main narrative and the underlying structure of this election was the question, are you in favor of Bibi or against Bibi? That was the organizing principle from A to Z. It was personal politics. It wasn't even really that much party politics, right? And you can see this too in all sorts of different ways, okay? And it was not about policies. It was not about the Arab-Israeli conflict. It was not about the question what to do with the West Bank or not to do with the West Bank, for instance, okay? So yeah, I will leave it at that.
Thank you, Cyrus. I would take another question as a follow-up on that issue.
Excuse me, if I may add
Sure.
a footnote to what he said. The COVID played a role, I would say, not in favor of Netanyahu when we look at the ultra-Orthodox communities. Because when Netanyahu basically asked to close the yeshivas, the ultra-Orthodox schools, what happened is that a number of young people who decided to follow classes via internet, via the web, they basically discovered the world. Meaning that two NGOs, Israeli NGOs, have been created recently to support the youth aged between 18 and 25 who have been either rejected or are leaving their ultra-Orthodox community because they are discovering the world outside the yeshiva. And this is an important point. I mean, there are no precise figures for the moment, but this is another line of fragmentation, I think. Yes.
Thank you, Riccardo. I would ask you this follow-up question by Melissa, asking, do you think Netanyahu is really warm to an Arab coalition in the context of his vaccine approach and full commitment to vaccinating the Arab population versus using vaccine for international diplomacy?
Well, there is a need to vaccinate the Arab population because otherwise there is a danger. I mean, not only the Arab population in Israel, but the Arab workers from the West Bank working in Israel. So the vaccination to have a safe Israeli population has to include the Palestinians, willing or not.
So let me take a few questions on Cyrus. Would you like to react on that, on this point?
No, I agree. I entirely agree with Riccardo.
So on what I mentioned as a second big theme, which emerges from the questions about what the elections reveal more at large on the fragmentation also within Israeli society. So I have several questions there. Let me take, because yeah, they are coming. So Cyrus, do you think that on the longer run, the fragmentation of the Israeli society could implode? This is Malek asking. And there was a follow-up question by him. But yeah, if you can elaborate on what the fragmentation revealed by the elections means for longer processes even increasing in the longer run? This was Malek's question.
I think the answer is really clear. There is no clear answer, right? One way of answering would be to say, well, these differences back in the past that then turned into real splits in the last maybe 10 years, 15 years, have been around for a long time, and people have talked about them, being crippling, and them basically perhaps in the future leading to some sort of, general, really societal dysfunction. And, all of this, people have said this before, and it hasn't fully happened, right? The institutions continue to work, more or less, but in most cases more than less. And there is, no open civil war or anything of that sort, going on. On the other side, you never quite know. I mean, I definitely don't think there's going to be a civil war. Though there was a very, actually a quite sort of a sadly funny take by the, principal Israeli comedy sort of show precisely on this. I think yesterday it aired sort of a 5-minute clip where somebody, basically one of the comedians, said, well, enough. What we need is a civil war. Every self-respecting country had one. We need to get rid of all these divisions. A winner needs to emerge. So let's just get to it, But jokes aside, sad jokes aside, so people have talked about this for a long time and have worried about it for a long time, and it hasn't happened, right? Then again, just because something hasn't happened in the past doesn't mean that it won't happen in the future, right? I would certainly err on the side of saying, I don't think this is, I certainly don't think that, Israeli society will simply, collapse. I definitely don't think that this is the case. And I'd add 2 specific things, and then I'll, hand back. One is that the trope, there is a long established, particularly Arab trope, of basically looking at Israel as a country that is on the brink of falling apart because it's not really a country, right? Because its society is too divided, which of course is not untrue, but the way in which it has been made, this trope is of course also a self-serving or a self-reflecting sort of trope, and or is wishful thinking, perhaps also, right, on the part of some Arab commentators, right? Hopefully the country will simply fall apart, and then this problem is going to be solved for us. And the second point is that there are really, and Riccardo basically pointed this out, there are very important factors that point into the other direction, into more integration, and by far most, actually 2 are, I mean, they're really, really important, right? And I should have actually mentioned this in the slideshow itself. The first one is that, professionally speaking, sociologically speaking, the Arab citizens of Israel, so I'm not talking about the Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza, but Israel's own Arab citizens are moving ahead. They're moving up in the world, right? And just to give you a specific example, there are tons of Arab doctors in Israel, and they really looked good last year and this year with COVID. But all of a sudden, oh, here they are, right? We see them all the time. They're taking one for the team, they're at the forefront, and so on and so forth. There is a very, very big, not majority, but very big, and self-respecting, Arab professional middle class. And they want politically in, right? That's one really big change, right? And they are ready to compromise on all sorts of different ideological issues to do that, right? They're not going to bend over, but they don't want to overthrow the state of Israel, definitely not. And the second really, really important integrating factor is the fact that you have more and more, particularly young, both male and female Orthodox, who are joining the workforce, the general workforce. So this on top of what Riccardo said himself, some people also leave the Orthodox community. That happens too. But I think that numerically speaking and economically speaking, perhaps more important is the fact that you have more and more Orthodox who are joining the workforce. there's a little trend almost to more of them joining the army and other institutions, but that's, I think, ultimately less important. Yeah.
Thank you.
Back to you, Christine.
Thank
Sorry,
you, Cyrus.
long answer, sorry.
So that brings me to the question I wanted to ask to Riccardo about what the elections reveal and mean for the peace process with Palestine.
For what?
The peace process.
What peace process? Well, for a long time, the Israeli successive governments have been saying that there was no partner for discussing peace on the Palestinian side. I think that the Palestinians can reasonably say today that there are no partners for discussing peace in Israel. I mean, what peace? At which conditions? I don't see how peace can be resumed. And if you look at the international scene, meaning the United States, the new Biden administration is probably not going to change much. So far, they have not been, for example, on the issue of the American embassy, which has been moved to West Jerusalem by Trump, they are not planning to go back to Tel Aviv. They have not been airing anything in relation to the annexation of the Golan Heights. On the other side, they might be resuming some funding for UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Work Agency for Palestinian refugees in the Near East, because Biden has been pleading his support to multilateralism. But even on that, if you look at what happened 10 days ago at the Human Rights Council in Geneva, where the United States are asking to be readmitted, they are saying that they would like to be readmitted on condition that the specific points of human rights and Israel should not be singled out as a unique item in the discussions at the Human Rights Council. On top, when you look at who is aiding right now the American diplomacy, Antony Blinken is an East Coast Jewish American, and he has made it clear his full support to Israel. So I hardly see how, though the Biden administration will be more moderate than the Trump administration, how this can factually feed new peace processes, discussion, etc., etc. I would also add a last point, which makes the bridge with what Cyrus explained very well on the implosion, not implosion of Israel. Definitely the integration mechanism that he outlined are at work, and they are very important. But there is another point, is that historically, Israel has been always used the menace of the Arab neighbors for keeping united. Now, there is no more menace from Arab neighbors. Militarily speaking, there is no hope that any Arab regime can confront, militarily speaking, Israel. But more than that, they've been opening normalization treaties with a number of Arab countries. Now, the only reason, the only menace that Netanyahu has been airing all the time is Iran. And that is a possible point of friction with the Biden administration, who would like to revert back to the Obama position on Iran. So Iran can be still used as an external menace to keep Jewish society united.
Thank you, Riccardo. And I would like to take now Diana's question.
Christine, sorry,
yes.
Can I jump in here? Could I just add a few things? Is that okay? Just very quickly. First, I want to say I would second everything Riccardo has said, and just add a few points. First, the Biden administration's, premier preoccupation at this moment, I think, is domestic. When it's foreign, it concerns rebuilding a broad alliance in order to basically stand vis-a-vis China, perhaps also Russia. Israel-Palestine is really pretty much, as far as the Biden administration is concerned, further down the list of preoccupations, unless and until it blows up. Now, the points that Riccardo just made, I think, are attempts by the Biden administration to make sure that it doesn't blow up. But not blowing up is not the same thing as solving a problem, of course, right? So one needs to distinguish them. Second issue, just to give a specific sort of, let's say, explanations from within the Israeli political party system about the basically likelihood of a solution, of any sort of solution to the conflict. I mean, my sense is that even centrist parties, somehow leftist parties like Yesh Atid, probably have an approach to solving this problem, if they have one at all, that is not going to meet the minimum requirements of the Palestinian sides. So it's not even a question, does Netanyahu, yes or no, is he able or ready to do this? I think it's also that the people more to the center are not really ready to do this, and the underlying reason is twofold. One is that for various reasons, the Israeli political scene has really moved to the right, starting with the Second Intifada 20 years ago, and has remained, right there in all sorts of different ways. And the second reason is that the Second Intifada failed, and since then, roughly since 2005, there has been no more military threat from within, by the Palestinian population. Gaza doesn't count as a really strategic threat, right? I would say. And that means that the Israeli population, the Jewish Israeli population, but also Arab Israeli population, has been, certainly the Jewish Israeli population, has been really able to simply disregard this issue in the last 15 years. It's just not really something that you think about every single day when you get up. It used to be that way in the Second Intifada, but it's not the case anymore. And so people simply don't see the burning reason why they should start to engage in this issue, right? Again, also centrist parties, also leftist parties. The really leftist parties, Meretz, that's another issue, but they have 6 seats at this moment. Back to you, Christine.
Thank you, Cyrus. And let me just bring what if's question as a follow-up, although you've already partly answered it. So his question, sorry, my screen is updating with the new question, so I lost it. Please bear with me with a second. Yes. So what is the new relationship between Biden and Netanyahu after these elections in terms of settlements, conflict with Iran and or other countries? And if this new victory by Netanyahu means a reinforcement of some radical positions in Israel?
Riccardo, shall I go first this time? Do you want to go first?
Yes. I mean, please go ahead.
Okay, let me make a few quick points. The first one is that this has nothing to do with the election. I am not so sure. Let's put it like this. The Iranian government has made serious strides in the last 3 to 4 years to economically and in terms of its trade flows, reorient itself such towards the east, China, Russia, and towards its immediate neighbors, Turkey, Iraq, Afghanistan, partly India, such that continued sanctions will hit it less than they used to. And this will have a long-term effect. This means in turn that the Iranians are not simply going to come crawling back to the negotiation table in order to re-sign what was signed, doubly because the Biden administration is under pressure, and perhaps some people in the Biden administration themselves would like to include now other elements in this treaty, which was not the case before. Back in 2015, it was only about the nuclear program, about nothing else. Now, a lot of people in the US say that's not okay. We need to address all sorts of other issues. The Iranians do not want to do that. So it's very unclear whether there really will be another treaty. That's point number one. Point number two is, has to do more of a sort of, it's again sort of an internal issue. I mean, I think Netanyahu certainly is against, a treaty, but at the same point in time, there are a good number of people in institutions that, including in the army and in the intelligence services, more broadly speaking, who are not necessarily against the treaty. So there is also a variety of different opinions within the Israeli establishment, not the government, but the security establishment regarding this question. So there are lots of other aspects, but I'll just keep it at these two.
Thank you, Sarah. Riccardo?
Yes. Simply starting from the question that was raised, Netanyahu has not won. Netanyahu has not been defeated. He has been, so far he has lost the battle, but not the war. So we have to see which will be the choice of Reuven Rivlin, the president, for naming somebody to form the government. The point made by Cyrus about the establishment is very important. It is clear that since the Gaza war of 2014, a number of generals in the army and the Shin Bet and the security services have been opposing the Netanyahu stance on a number of issues, not only on the 2014 war, but also later on in the same year concerning accident to the Temple Mounts, etc., etc. Now, the point is that the military-industrial complex in Israel is thriving. I mean, there are many examples. The latest is Azerbaijan. You remember the recent war in the between the Armenians and Azerbaijan. Who was behind Azerbaijan in selling a number of weapons? There was Israel. So the capacity of the military-industrial complex to not only let's say, bluntly speaking, make money, but with alliances, with improbable allies, is really a point to take into account.
Thank you. Let me now take Diana's earlier question, if I may. To what extent did the normalization with Gulf countries impact the Jewish vote in favor of Netanyahu? Riccardo, Cyrus, would you like to take?
Well, the normalization treaty is manifold. For countries like Morocco, that's an interesting point because many Jewish Israelis of Moroccan origin have been able and will be able to go back to Morocco. I mean, this for effective reasons, but also this will boost the Moroccan tourism industry. On the other side, with the Gulf countries, there we are talking about investments at different levels. Plus, again, a possible role for the Israeli military-industrial complex, because the UAE, Bahrain, may ultimately wants to benefit from Israeli expertise in the security sector, and as well as their weapons. So that's that may have influenced the vote, the Jewish Israeli vote in favor of Netanyahu, but how, because of the COVID for the moment, the situation is uncertain about traveling, about migrating, etc. But the possibilities are there. So we will have to see, to wait and see.
If I may add just a few points, I tend to think that this development had no direct consequences for electorate's choice. This doesn't mean, however, I totally agree with Riccardo, that it didn't matter to people. I think it did. But the other question, am I in favor or against Bibi, just weighted much more, right? Which is actually quite interesting. It tells you something about the intensity of feelings people now have about the prime minister. You're talking about the dream of Zionist normalization in the Arab world. It happens. And people say, I don't really care that much about it. This guy is totally corrupt. I'm voting against him. Or they're saying, that's really nice. Another, feather in his cap. Anyway, whether it happens or not, I'm going to vote for him. Nothing else, only him, right? So it's not that it didn't matter, but it was less important than, right? Last little sort of, addition. I mean, I find it, well, just actually to second something and to remind you of something that Riccardo had said. It's quite possible that business opportunities will also accrue for Arab citizens of Israel, right? And that I think might be, and Riccardo said this, just to repeat, a really interesting development to watch.
Wafa is asking how you foresee the relations of Israel after the elections with the Gulf, Abraham Accords, really referring to that, with Jordan and Egypt. Riccardo would like to take this question first.
Well, for the moment, the relation with Jordan has been jeopardized, as well as partly with the United Arab Emirates for the latest events. There has been a proposed quick visit by Netanyahu to the United Arab Emirates, which was cancelled at the last minute, as well as the possibility for the brother of King Abdullah II, the King of Jordan, to visit the Haram al-Sharif. The Hashemites are officially the protector of the Haram al-Sharif in Jerusalem. So we have now a cold relationship between Jordan, the UAE, and Netanyahu due to the latest developments. And probably the crisis with Jordan can deepen according to how Netanyahu will handle the situation. Knowing that the king has not been speaking with Netanyahu for almost 2 years, he has been having chats and discussion only with Benny Gantz. So the situation is difficult to forecast, but yeah, that has to be taken into account. Egypt is trying to play a role, as usual, in the intra-Palestinian debates on the reconciliation between Fatah and Hamas. But I don't see particular issues of contention between Egypt and Israel so far.
Thank you, Riccardo. Cyrus, would you like to add anything?
No.
Or shall I take it? There are many questions. Thank you, everyone, for actively participating. So I'm sorry we won't be able to take them all. So maybe 3 questions to conclude. And so I'll read them one after the other, and then maybe you can either have a joint answer to those questions or select those. So there was a question by Marin about the reasons of Israel going more right after every election, is it a result of the growing sentiment in the Israeli population that the Human Rights Council is more anti-Israel than pro-human rights? Which connects to the question by Zineb, who is asking how the ICC remarks played out during the campaign among Israeli voters and parties, and to some extent, the outcome of the elections. And another question from Christophe, who is wondering whether the diaspora can vote, and if yes, what was the impact on the outcome? If not, could that be something to change in the electoral system in the future? Thank you for the great discussion. So that's the questions that we can take for the moment, given the time constraints. So thank you, everyone. And I leave you both provide a few inputs on those questions to conclude.
Go ahead, Cyrus.
Thank you, Riccardo. But like all, excellent questions as those before, the non-Israeli citizen diaspora, meaning people who are Jews and don't have Israeli citizenship, of course, cannot vote. They can pretty easily become Israelis if they want to by immigrating, but they would need to do that first. And I really, really, really do not think that this is going to change. Why has Israeli politics moved more and more to the right in the last, 15 years or so, 20 years? It's a really, really complicated question, honestly. There are long-term factors. The probably most important really long-term factor is the occupation. For multiple reasons, actually. It gave renewed energies to religious Zionism in all sorts of different forms. It could only make certain militaristic tendencies easier, which certainly is more associated with the right and with the left. It ultimately helped lead to the second Intifada, which was seen by the big majority of Israelis as the proof that the Palestinians can't be trusted, or not the partner, etc., etc. And that really was that in terms of if you think in, as it were, midterm sort of periodizational effects, I think that really was the turning point, right? But that in and by itself doesn't explain why it has continued, why this move has continued to be the case, right? Certainly the fact that you have at this point almost not quite 1 million settlers yet, but we're slowly but surely getting there, who have a lot of influence within the Likud, right, which they used not to have, but that they now do, certainly has helped, right? So the biggest political party in the last 20 years, the Likud, I mean, for more or less the majority of the last 20 years, has become much more right-wing itself, right? And so here are some starts of answers. I'll hand over to Riccardo.
Yeah, I maybe pick up on one point that was raised is the ICC, the International Criminal Court. Fatou Bensouda is reaching the end of her mandate, and by June we will have a new prosecutor at ICC. And we don't know if the new prosecutor will pursue the policy or the policy of Fatou Bensouda. But what is important to notice in that regard is that the prosecutor began by raising the issue of the 2014 war to investigate crimes of war both by Israel and Hamas. But now they have been opening a few weeks ago also the case for crimes of war, and the occupation. And this is a very serious case because not only Israel is not recognizing its own occupation of Palestinian lands, but if the prosecutor is going ahead on the question of occupation and the crimes committed by the Israeli armed forces since 1967, this will be a big, big, big issue. Now, I'd like to conclude on a small point, but Cyrus reminded us that the narrative, the main narrative of these elections have been are we for or against King Bibi Netanyahu? And I'd like to say, for those of you who like cinema, there is a recent very good documentary by Dan Shadur called King Bibi, which was released at the end of 2018. And if you want to have a very precise and insightful documentary that tells you the life and history of Netanyahu, this is the right documentary to watch. You can find it online. You can buy it through video on demand on Vimeo for $5 to $7, something like that. But I think is a very powerful and very critical and interesting documentary shot by an Israeli filmmaker. Is a must-see for looking at the background of these elections in terms of King Bibi.
Thank you very, very much, Riccardo and Cyrus. This was a fascinating discussion and with so many excellent points that we will keep in mind as we are following the news and the analysis. So thank you very much to both of you. Thank you very much for the audience for joining us today. And you can follow the activities of the Grad Institute on our website, and the recording of this lunch briefing will be available on the Grad Institute's YouTube channel. So have a very good afternoon, and we look forward to being in touch. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Christine, for sharing, and thanks, Riccardo, as always, for doing this together.
Thank you to all of you and all to the participants for the very good questions.
Indeed. Thank you, and goodbye.